They thought she was just a helpless old widow, ripe for the picking. Dorothy Henderson had spent months living under her son Michael's roof, convinced by her new daughter-in-law Amanda that her own apartment wasn't safe anymore. She'd contributed $15,000 to their house down payment, believing she was helping her family build a future. But the morning after Michael and Amanda's wedding, when Amanda walked through the front door with a notary in tow and a stack of legal documents, Dorothy realized she'd been living in a carefully constructed trap. The papers would sign away her independence, her assets, and her dignity, shipping her off to assisted living while Amanda claimed everything Dorothy had worked for. What Amanda didn't know was that Dorothy Henderson had survived 68 years by being far sharper than anyone gave her credit for. And sometimes, the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. What happened next didn't just save Dorothy's fortune. It exposed a web of lies that would bring down a career criminal and restore a family torn apart by greed. Dorothy Henderson had always prided herself on her sharp mind and keen instincts, qualities that had served her well during 43 years of marriage to her beloved Robert. When Robert passed away 2 years ago, leaving her with a modest but comfortable estate, Dorothy thought her biggest challenge would be learning to live alone. She never imagined that her greatest threat would come from within her own family. It had started innocently enough. Michael, her only child, had been dating Amanda Winters for about 8 months when he brought her home for Sunday dinner. Amanda was everything Dorothy wasn't: young, polished, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an outfit that probably cost more than Dorothy's monthly grocery budget. But she was charming, asking all the right questions about Dorothy's garden and commenting admiringly on the family photos scattered throughout the living room. "Your mother is absolutely delightful," Amanda had whispered to Michael that evening, loud enough for Dorothy to overhear. "You can tell she raised you with such love and care." Dorothy had felt a warm glow of pride. Finally, Michael had found someone who appreciated family values. Over the following months, Amanda became a regular presence at Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. She would arrive with expensive wine and elaborate desserts, always insisting that Dorothy shouldn't have gone to so much trouble. "You work so hard," Amanda would coo, taking Dorothy's weathered hands in her manicured ones. "You deserve to be taken care of for once." The first red flag came when Amanda began asking detailed questions about Dorothy's living situation. "Aren't you nervous living alone in that big apartment?" she'd wonder aloud. "I read an article about break-ins in your neighborhood. And what if you fell? Who would know?" Dorothy had laughed it off initially. She'd lived independently for 2 years without incident, and her neighbors were wonderfully attentive. But Amanda persisted, sharing increasingly alarming news stories about elderly people who'd suffered accidents with no one around to help. Soon, Michael was joining the conversation, his brow furrowed with worry. "Maybe Amanda has a point, Mom," he'd said during one particularly intense discussion. "Would you consider moving in with us? Just temporarily, while we figure out a long-term plan." Dorothy had resisted at first, but Amanda's campaign of concern was relentless. Articles about home invasions would mysteriously appear on Dorothy's coffee table when Amanda visited. Stories about elderly neighbors who'd been scammed out of their life savings became regular conversation topics. And through it all, Amanda's solution remained constant. Dorothy would be so much safer living with them. The breakthrough came when Dorothy's upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chun, mentioned that she'd seen a suspicious man lurking around the building. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. The man was Mrs. Patterson's nephew from Portland, but Amanda seized on the incident as proof that Dorothy's building was becoming dangerous. "That settles it," Amanda had declared, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Dorothy, you're moving in with us this weekend. I won't sleep peacefully knowing you're in danger." Michael, thoroughly convinced by his fiancée's passionate concern, wouldn't hear any objections. "It's just until we can find you something safer, Mom. Maybe a nice senior community with security." Looking back, Dorothy realized that this had been Amanda's first major victory. By painting herself as the loving, protective daughter-in-law and framing Dorothy as vulnerable and at risk, Amanda had successfully separated Dorothy from her established support network and brought her under direct control. Life in Michael and Amanda's house had been comfortable enough at first. Dorothy had her own bedroom and bathroom, and Amanda insisted she should feel free to make herself at home. But gradually, subtly, things began to change. Amanda would mention Dorothy's confusion in casual conversation. She couldn't remember where she put her reading glasses again yesterday, Amanda would tell Michael with a concerned sigh. They were on her head the whole time. Or, your mother seemed a little disoriented when I got home from work. She said she'd been waiting for someone to pick her up for a doctor's appointment, but she didn't have any appointments scheduled. These incidents had actually happened, but Amanda's retelling stripped away the context that made them perfectly normal. Dorothy had indeed spent 10 minutes looking for her reading glasses, just as she had countless times throughout her adult life. She had been confused about a doctor's appointment, but only because Amanda had offered to drive her and then changed the appointment time without telling Dorothy. But Michael, busy with his demanding job as a software engineer, only heard Amanda's carefully curated reports. To him, it seemed like his mother was experiencing troubling memory issues that were escalating rapidly. Amanda's documentation of Dorothy's supposed decline became increasingly detailed. She started a journal, which she would occasionally leave open on the kitchen counter where Dorothy could see it. Entries like, Dorothy left the stove burner on for 2 hours today, safety concern, and found Dorothy in the backyard at 6 a.m., claimed she was checking the garden, but seemed confused about the time, painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality. The truth was that Dorothy had turned on the burner to make tea and then got distracted by a phone call from her old friend Margaret. And yes, she had gone outside at 6 a.m., because she'd always been an early riser and genuinely wanted to check on the tomatoes that she'd planted along the back fence. But Amanda's clinical documentation made these normal behaviors seem like symptoms of cognitive decline. The wedding planning had been another source of stress, though Dorothy tried to hide her growing unease. Amanda insisted on an expensive affair, despite Michael's modest income. When Dorothy hesitantly suggested that the young couple might want to start their marriage without taking on significant debt, Amanda's response was swift and cutting. I understand that your generation had different expectations, Amanda had said, her voice dripping with condescension. But Michael and I want our wedding to reflect our commitment to building a life together. We're not interested in some courthouse ceremony. The implication was clear. Dorothy's suggestions were outdated and inappropriate. Michael, caught between his mother and his fiancée, sided with Amanda. Mom, it's our wedding, he said quietly. We appreciate your concern, but we can handle our finances. When Amanda mentioned that they were struggling to pull together the down payment for their dream house, Dorothy made what she believed was a generous gesture. She offered to contribute $15,000 from Robert's life insurance policy, money she'd been saving for emergencies or future care needs. Amanda's reaction was effusive. She threw her arms around Dorothy, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't believe how generous you are, she sobbed. Michael, your mother is an angel. An absolute angel. But even this gesture became another tool in Amanda's arsenal. At the engagement party, she made a speech that publicly highlighted Dorothy's financial contribution while subtly portraying her as needy and dependent. I want everyone to know what an incredible mother-in-law I'm gaining, Amanda announced, raising her champagne glass. Dorothy has been so generous with us, contributing to our home down payment even though she's living on a fixed income. She's shown us what it means to put family first, even when it means sacrificing your own security. Michael is so lucky to have a mother who would give up her own independence to help her children succeed. The speech received warm applause, but Dorothy felt a chill of humiliation. Amanda had managed to make her generosity sound like dependence, her contributions sound like sacrifice, and her temporary living arrangement sound permanent. In front of all their friends and family, Dorothy had been cast as the elderly parent who relied on her children's charity rather than as a woman making an independent choice to help her son. The wedding itself was a blur of expensive flowers, elaborate decorations, and Amanda's radiant smile as she posed for endless photographs. Dorothy tried to enjoy the celebration, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching a performance rather than a genuine expression of love. During the reception, several family friends approached Dorothy with comments that made her increasingly uncomfortable. It's so wonderful that Michael and Amanda are taking such good care of you, Dorothy's old neighbor, Mrs. Franklin, said with a sympathetic pat on the arm. Amanda was just telling me how worried she's been about your memory issues. It takes special people to take on that kind of responsibility. Dorothy was stunned. She'd never discussed any memory issues with Amanda because she didn't have any memory issues. But clearly, Amanda had been sharing her concerns with others, building a narrative of Dorothy's decline that extended far beyond their immediate family. As the evening wore on, Dorothy began to notice a pattern in these conversations. Friend after friend expressed admiration for Amanda's selfless care of her ailing mother-in-law. They spoke as if Dorothy's cognitive decline was common knowledge, as if her need for supervision was obvious to everyone present. By the time Dorothy returned to her room that night, she felt as though she were living in a funhouse mirror version of her own life. According to the story Amanda was telling, Dorothy was a confused, dependent elderly woman who couldn't manage on her own. But Dorothy knew her own mind was sharp, her judgment sound, and her independence hard-won. The disconnect was jarring and frightening. She lay awake most of that night, trying to piece together how her reality had become so distorted. When she finally fell asleep near dawn, she was haunted by dreams of being trapped in a maze with walls that shifted every time she thought she'd found the way out. Dorothy woke the next morning to the sound of voices in the kitchen. She checked her bedside clock, 8:30 a.m. Not unusually late, but later than her normal routine. As she dressed and prepared to join Michael and Amanda for breakfast, she felt a sense of unease that she couldn't quite identify. The voices in the kitchen were too formal, too businesslike for a casual morning after a wedding. As Dorothy approached, she could hear Amanda speaking in crisp, professional tones that were completely different from her usual warm, caring demeanor. The evaluation period has been thorough and well documented, Amanda was saying. We have 6 months of detailed observations, including incidents of confusion, disorientation, and unsafe behavior. The medical documentation supports our assessment that she requires supervised care. Dorothy froze in the hallway, her heart pounding. Who were they talking about? And why did Amanda sound like she was conducting a business meeting? I understand your concerns, an unfamiliar male voice replied. But these are serious legal documents. Once she signs, the transfer of assets and guardianship rights will be immediate and comprehensive. Are you certain she won't resist? She'll sign, Amanda said with cold confidence. She's become increasingly dependent on us, and she trusts our judgment. Besides, we've positioned this as being in her best interest. She believes we're helping her. Dorothy's knees went weak. They were talking about her. Amanda was discussing transferring Dorothy's assets and guardianship rights, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a human being with her own will and desires. Forcing herself to remain calm, Dorothy crept closer to the kitchen doorway and peered around the corner. Amanda sat at the kitchen table across from a middle-aged man in a dark suit. Between them were several official-looking documents and a notary stamp. Michael stood near the coffee maker, his back to the table, his shoulders tense with discomfort. He wasn't participating in the conversation, but he wasn't objecting either. The Sunset Manor facility has already approved her application, Amanda continued, consulting her notes. They'll have a room available next week. The transition should be smooth, especially since she's been living here and has already become accustomed to a supervised environment. Sunset Manor. Dorothy felt sick. She'd driven past that assisted living facility countless times, a sterile, institutional building with a small, fenced courtyard where residents sat in wheelchairs, staring at nothing. It was exactly the kind of place she'd feared ending up, the kind of place Robert had made her promise to avoid. And the financial arrangements? The notary asked. All documented here, Amanda replied, sliding a folder across the table. The $15,000 she contributed to our down payment was clearly intended as a gift, despite what she may claim now. Her other assets, the savings account, the life insurance policy, the jewelry, will be held in trust and managed for her benefit. Of course, the costs of her care will be substantial. Dorothy realized with crystalline clarity that she was witnessing the final phase of an elaborate con game. Amanda hadn't fallen in love with Michael. She'd targeted him because his widowed mother represented an easy mark. The months of subtle manipulation, the careful documentation of Dorothy's supposed incompetence, the isolation from her support network, it had all been building to this moment. But what chilled Dorothy most was the casual way Amanda discussed dismantling her entire life. Her independence, her home, her financial security, even her relationship with her own son. Amanda was prepared to take it all with the stroke of a pen. So grab your popcorn, because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. Dorothy took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the kitchen with all the dignity she could muster. "Good morning, everyone," she said pleasantly, as if she hadn't just overheard them planning to strip away her freedom and assets. "What brings you here so early on a Sunday morning, sir?" Amanda's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and then a bright, fake smile. "Dorothy, dear, I hope we didn't wake you. This is Mr. Peterson, a notary public. Michael and I thought this would be a good time to take care of some paperwork." "Paperwork?" Dorothy asked innocently, pouring herself a cup of coffee with steady hands. "What kind of paperwork requires a notary on the morning after your wedding?" Michael finally turned around, his face flushed with guilt and embarrassment. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation. Amanda and I have been discussing some options that might be better for you." "Better for me?" Dorothy repeated, settling into a chair across from the notary. "How thoughtful. What did you have in mind?" Amanda leaned forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone Dorothy had grown to despise. "We found a wonderful place called Sunset Manor. It's a full-service community where you'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, and professional staff available around the clock. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." "It sounds like a prison," Dorothy observed mildly. "Oh no," Amanda protested, though her smile became more strained. "It's a beautiful facility. And honestly, Dorothy, we've all been worried about you. Living alone isn't safe anymore, and even living here, you've had some concerning episodes." Dorothy took a sip of her coffee, buying herself time to think. She could see the trap closing around her, but she also recognized something Amanda had missed. Dorothy had spent decades as Robert's partner in his accounting business. She understood legal documents, financial structures, and the importance of reading the fine print. "Could I see these papers before I sign anything?" Dorothy asked pleasantly. "Of course," Mr. Peterson said, sliding the documents across the table. "This first form establishes your residence at Sunset Manor and designates Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell as your primary contacts for medical and financial decisions." Dorothy put on her reading glasses and began to examine the documents carefully. The more she read, the more her anger grew. These weren't just admission papers for an assisted living facility. They were comprehensive legal documents that would effectively make Amanda and Michael her guardians, transfer control of her assets to them, and strip away virtually all of her legal rights as an independent adult. "This is quite thorough," Dorothy said after several minutes of careful reading. "You've thought of everything." Amanda visibly relaxed. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Dorothy. We know this is a big change, but it's really for the best." Dorothy looked up from the papers, her eyes sharp and focused in a way that made Amanda's smile falter slightly. "I'm curious about something, dear. This document refers to my $15,000 contribution to your down payment as a wedding gift. But I distinctly remember writing a check with loan written in the memo line. Do you happen to recall that?" Amanda's face went through another rapid transformation. The sweet, caring mask slipped slightly, revealing something much colder underneath. "Dorothy, honey, I think you might be confused about that. You were so generous to give us that money as a wedding gift. You said you wanted to help us start our marriage on solid ground." "Did I?" Dorothy asked thoughtfully. "How interesting. Because I have the canceled check right here in my purse, along with the promissory note you and Michael signed acknowledging it as a loan to be repaid over 5 years at 3% interest." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Amanda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Michael stared at his mother in shock. Dorothy reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila folder. "I also have copies of all the financial documents related to my accounts, my insurance policies, and my estate planning. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you have a clear mind and access to a copy machine." She spread the papers across the table, methodically organizing them as Amanda and the notary watched in growing alarm. "Here's something particularly interesting," Dorothy continued, pulling out a printed email. "This is a message from Amanda to her friend Jessica, discussing what she calls the Dorothy situation. Would you like me to read the relevant passage?" Amanda lunged forward, trying to snatch the email, but Dorothy calmly held it out of reach. "The old bat is finally starting to crack," Dorothy read aloud in Amanda's voice. 6 more weeks of the confused elderly woman act, and she'll be ready to sign over everything. Michael's so worried about his precious mommy's declining mental state that he'll support whatever I recommend. The Sunset Manor deposit is already paid, and once she's locked up there, We can liquidate her assets and use the money for the European honeymoon I've been planning." Michael's face had gone completely white. "Amanda, please tell me this isn't real." But Amanda was no longer bothering to maintain her sweet facade. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and filled with frustrated rage. "You have no right to read my private correspondence," she snapped at Dorothy. "I have every right to protect myself from fraud," Dorothy replied calmly. "Which is exactly what this is, elder financial abuse with a side of identity theft and conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud." She turned to the notary, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mr. Peterson, I assume Amanda hired you to notarize my signature on these documents. Did she mention that I hadn't seen them yet, or that she was planning to coerce me into signing them under false pretenses?" Mr. Peterson began gathering his things hastily. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. I'll need to reschedule this appointment once all parties have had time to review the documentation properly." "There's no misunderstanding," Dorothy said firmly. "There's a deliberate attempt to defraud an elderly person, and you were brought here to legitimize it. I suggest you leave immediately and consider very carefully whether you want your name associated with this kind of scheme." The notary practically fled, leaving his business cards scattered on the table in his haste to escape. Amanda watched him go, then turned back to Dorothy with undisguised hostility. "You think you're so smart, don't you? But you're still a confused old woman living in our house, dependent on our generosity. Michael will side with me because he loves me and because he knows you're not capable of taking care of yourself anymore." "Is that what you think?" Dorothy asked quietly. "Michael, do I seem confused or incapable to you right now?" Michael was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Amanda, how could you write those things about my mother? How could you plan this behind my back?" "Because someone had to take care of the situation," Amanda shot back, her voice rising. "She's a burden, Michael. She's old, she's taking up space in our house, and she's sitting on assets that could be put to better use. I was solving our problems." "Our problems?" Michael repeated incredulously. "My mother helping us buy a house was a problem? Your mother manipulating us with guilt and money was a problem," Amanda corrected. "Just like her showing up here with her little folder of documents, trying to make me look bad. She's been plotting against me from the beginning." Dorothy had heard enough. "Amanda, dear, I think you're confused about who's been plotting against whom. But don't worry. I have a solution that will clear up this confusion once and for all." She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. "I'd like to report an attempted elder financial abuse case," she said calmly into the phone. "The perpetrator is here in my presence with forged documents and evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud." Amanda's face went completely pale. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am," Dorothy replied, still holding the phone. "You see, Amanda, I may be 68 years old, but I'm not helpless, and I'm certainly not stupid. I've been documenting your behavior for the past month, ever since I started to suspect what you were really after." She pulled another folder from her seemingly bottomless handbag. "I have photographs of you going through my personal papers when you thought I was napping. I have recordings of conversations where you discussed my supposed mental decline with people I've never even met. And I have testimony from several of your previous victims." "Previous victims?" Michael asked weakly. "Oh yes," Dorothy said with grim satisfaction. "It turns out our Amanda has quite a history. Patricia Winters, Amanda's mother, was very helpful when I called her yesterday. She's been wondering where her daughter disappeared to this time." Amanda was backing toward the kitchen door, but Dorothy continued relentlessly. "Amanda's real name is Amanda Patricia Winterschen Rodriguez, though she's used several others. She's been married 3 times before, always to men with elderly relatives. The pattern is always the same. She targets the family member with the most assets, isolates them, documents their supposed incompetence, and then arranges for their institutionalization while claiming guardianship of their estate." Michael sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "This can't be happening. Her first victim was her own grandmother," Dorothy continued. "Then her elderly uncle, her second husband's father, and her third husband's mother. The authorities have been looking for her for 2 years, ever since she disappeared with over $300,000 that belonged to a 90-year-old woman in Phoenix." The sound of sirens was growing closer. Amanda made a desperate last attempt to salvage the situation. "Michael, you can't believe this," she pleaded, dropping to her knees beside his chair. I love you. Everything I did was for us, for our future together. Your mother is trying to destroy our marriage because she's jealous of what we have." Michael looked up at her with profound sadness. "Amanda, you just tried to steal my mother's life savings and have her declared incompetent so you could lock her in a nursing home. How am I supposed to believe anything you say?" The police arrived within minutes, followed shortly by detectives who seemed very interested in Amanda's identity and whereabouts. It turned out that there were warrants for her arrest in 3 states, and Dorothy's evidence was exactly what they'd been hoping to find. As Amanda was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to Dorothy with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, you old witch. I'll find a way to make you pay for this." Dorothy smiled serenely. "I don't think so, dear. Where you're going, the only person you'll be manipulating is your cellmate." The next few hours were a whirlwind of police interviews, evidence collection, and paperwork. Dorothy found herself energized rather than exhausted by the ordeal. For months, she'd felt like she was slowly disappearing, her identity and autonomy being stripped away bit by bit. Now, suddenly, she was herself again, sharp, competent, and in control of her own life. Michael, on the other hand, was devastated. As the full scope of Amanda's deception became clear, he realized how completely he'd been manipulated. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen what she was doing." "Sweetheart," Dorothy said gently, "she's a professional con artist. Her entire life revolves around being convincing. You were supposed to believe her. That was the whole point." But what happened next truly shocked everyone, including Dorothy herself. 3 weeks later, Dorothy received a phone call from Patricia Winters, Amanda's mother. Patricia was a soft-spoken woman in her 70s who sounded remarkably like Amanda when she spoke, except that her voice carried genuine warmth and regret. "Mrs. Henderson," Patricia said, "I wanted to call and apologize for my daughter's actions. I also wanted to make things right, if possible." It turned out that Patricia had been trying to track down her daughter's victims for years, hoping to make some form of restitution. She'd managed to recover some of the stolen assets from Amanda's previous schemes, and she wanted to establish a fund to help the elderly people her daughter had victimized. "I can't undo the emotional damage she's caused," Patricia explained during their first face-to-face meeting. "But I can at least try to restore some of what she stole." Patricia's generosity extended beyond money. She became a regular visitor to Dorothy's life, and the two women discovered they had a great deal in common. Both had been widowed, both had complicated relationships with adult children, and both had learned hard lessons about trust and vulnerability in their later years. Michael, meanwhile, was working through his own recovery process. The dissolution of his marriage was painful, but it also opened his eyes to how much he'd neglected his relationship with his mother. He'd been so eager to start his new life with Amanda that he'd been willing to sideline the woman who'd raised him and supported him through every challenge he'd ever faced. "I kept thinking Amanda was protecting you," he confessed during one of their long talks. "She was so convincing when she talked about your safety and your needs. I thought I was being a good son by supporting her recommendations." Dorothy understood his guilt, but she also recognized that Amanda's manipulation had been designed specifically to exploit his love and concern. "She knew exactly which buttons to push," Dorothy told him. "She studied us both and crafted her approach to make us both feel like we were doing the right thing." The legal proceedings dragged on for months, but the outcome was never in doubt. Amanda's history of elder fraud was well documented, and Dorothy's evidence was comprehensive and damning. Amanda ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of probation and an order to pay full restitution to her victims. The day of Amanda's sentencing, Dorothy sat in the courtroom gallery and watched as the judge delivered her statement. It was a moment of complete vindication, not just for Dorothy, but for all of Amanda's previous victims who had never received justice. "Mrs. Winters," the judge said sternly, "you have made a career out of exploiting the most vulnerable members of our society. You have violated the trust of families, stolen the life savings of elderly people, and caused immeasurable emotional damage to your victims and their loved ones. This court finds your actions to be particularly heinous because they targeted individuals who should have been able to count on family for protection and support." Amanda showed no remorse. Even as she was led away to begin her sentence, She maintained that she was the victim of a conspiracy by vindictive elderly people who couldn't accept that they were no longer capable of managing their own affairs. But Dorothy knew better. She'd seen Amanda's true face in those final moments in the kitchen, when the mask had finally slipped completely away. Amanda wasn't a misguided woman who'd made poor choices. She was a predator who'd spent years perfecting her technique for exploiting elderly people's vulnerabilities. The impact of Dorothy's victory extended far beyond her own family. The local news picked up the story, and Dorothy found herself being interviewed by reporters who were fascinated by her methodical approach to gathering evidence against her would-be abuser. The story resonated with adult children who'd been struggling with similar concerns about elderly parents, and with elderly people who recognized their own vulnerabilities in Dorothy's experience. Dorothy began speaking at community groups and senior centers, sharing her story as a way to educate others about the warning signs of elder financial abuse. She discovered that she had a gift for public speaking, and that sharing her experience was therapeutic for both herself and her audiences. The most important thing to remember, she would tell these groups, is that getting older doesn't mean getting helpless. Yes, we may become more physically vulnerable, and yes, we need to be realistic about our changing capabilities. But our minds, our judgment, and our right to make our own decisions don't disappear just because we reach a certain age. She would always end her presentations with the same message: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And never let anyone convince you that asking questions or seeking independent advice is a sign of confusion or incompetence. It's a sign of wisdom. Michael's recovery from the betrayal took longer, but it was ultimately more complete. He realized that his relationship with Amanda had been based on illusion from the very beginning. She'd presented herself as the person she thought he wanted her to be, not as the person she actually was. Learning to trust his own judgment again was a gradual process, but it was made easier by his renewed closeness with his mother. They established new traditions and found new ways to support each other that didn't involve Dorothy sacrificing her independence or Michael feeling guilty about his mother's needs. Dorothy moved back to her own apartment, but they talked daily and had dinner together twice a week. Michael helped with tasks that were genuinely challenging for Dorothy: heavy lifting, technology problems, and complex financial decisions. But he no longer treated her as if she were incapable of managing her own life. The $15,000 that Dorothy had contributed to the house down payment was returned in full, along with interest. Michael insisted on this, even though Dorothy told him it wasn't necessary. "It is necessary," he said firmly. "You made that loan in good faith, and Amanda manipulated both of us to turn it into something else. I want to honor the original agreement we made." But perhaps the most unexpected development was Dorothy's relationship with Patricia Winters. What had started as an awkward conversation between two women connected by Amanda's crimes gradually evolved into a genuine friendship. Patricia moved to town to be closer to her granddaughter Emma, Amanda's daughter from her first marriage, who was now living with Patricia full-time. Emma was a bright, resilient 12-year-old who'd been shuffled between relatives for most of her life, while her mother pursued her various schemes. She'd learned not to get too attached to people or places, because Amanda's lifestyle meant constant upheaval and instability. Dorothy found herself drawn to Emma, recognizing in the girl's wariness and independence something of her own younger self. She began volunteering to help with Emma's homework and gradually became a fixture in Patricia's household. "You know," Patricia said one evening as they watched Emma practice piano in the living room, "I think you've given Emma something she's never had before, the stability of a relationship with someone who's not going anywhere." Dorothy was surprised to find tears in her eyes. "She's given me something too, a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost." 6 months after Amanda's sentencing, Dorothy received a letter in prison mail. For a moment, she considered throwing it away unopened, but her curiosity got the better of her. The letter was brief and filled with the same manipulative language Amanda had always used. "Dorothy, I hope you're satisfied with destroying my family and my life. I hope you enjoy living with the knowledge that you've separated a mother from her child and a wife from her husband. You may have convinced everyone else that you're the victim here, but we both know the truth. You're a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see Michael happy with someone young and beautiful. You've won for now, but people like you always end up alone and forgotten. I hope it was worth it." Dorothy read the letter twice, then tore it into small pieces, and threw it in the trash. Amanda still didn't understand that her downfall had been her own doing, not Dorothy's. She still believed she was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destruction. But Dorothy didn't waste any more time thinking about Amanda's delusions. She had a life to live, a family to enjoy, and a community to serve. At 68, she was busier and happier than she'd been in years. The following Christmas, Dorothy hosted dinner for what she jokingly called her chosen family: Michael, Patricia, Emma, and several neighbors who'd become close friends during the aftermath of Amanda's schemes. As she looked around the table at the faces of people she loved and who loved her in return, Dorothy realized that Amanda had actually done her a favor. By trying to steal Dorothy's independence and isolate her from genuine relationships, Amanda had inadvertently shown Dorothy just how precious those things were. The experience had taught Dorothy to value her sharp mind, her strong will, and her ability to fight for herself and others. It had also brought her closer to Michael and introduced her to Patricia and Emma, relationships that had enriched her life immeasurably. During dinner, Emma asked Dorothy to tell the story of how she'd caught Amanda red-handed. It had become one of Emma's favorite stories, partly because it featured a clever older woman outwitting a younger antagonist, but mostly because it demonstrated that being underestimated could actually be an advantage. The key, Dorothy explained, cutting into her slice of apple pie, was realizing that Amanda's greatest weakness was her arrogance. She was so convinced that I was helpless and confused that she stopped being careful. She left evidence lying around. She had conversations in front of me that she shouldn't have, and she underestimated my ability to investigate and plan. She thought you were just a silly old lady, Emma said with satisfaction. Exactly, Dorothy replied. And I let her think that, right up until the moment I was ready to spring my trap. Sometimes the best weapon you can have is someone else's overconfidence. Michael raised his wine glass. To my mother, he said, who taught a career criminal that there's no such thing as an easy mark. To Dorothy, Patricia added, who showed all of us what real strength looks like. As they toasted, Dorothy felt a deep sense of contentment. She'd faced down a predator, protected her assets and independence, and emerged stronger and more connected than before. She'd also helped ensure that Amanda would never again be able to target elderly victims, and that Emma would grow up with the stability and love she deserved. But perhaps most importantly, Dorothy had reclaimed her own narrative. For months, Amanda had been rewriting Dorothy's story, casting her as a confused, dependent elderly woman who needed to be managed and controlled. Now Dorothy was the author of her own story again, and it was a story of wisdom, courage, and triumph. If this story of courage and cunning touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Dorothy Henderson's victory reminds us that age is never a barrier to strength, and that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who's underestimated. Her story proves that with sharp thinking, careful planning, and the courage to fight back, even the most vulnerable among us can emerge victorious against those who would prey upon them. In a world where elder abuse is all too common, Dorothy's triumph stands as a beacon of hope and a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied to those brave enough to seek it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply refusing to be a victim and showing the world that wisdom and experience are weapons no con artist can overcome.